now it's time to get irritated with Hegel, maybe with the Roman Empire. Our next speaker is ller, and his talk is entitled Colonizing the Colonizer, Hegel on the Germanic Conquest of the West Roman Empire and its world historical significance. ller is professor of philosophy at the University of Munich, where he took mandatory retirement from his teaching and service duties in September 2020. His research covers a broad range of figures and topics in modern philosophy, including unlimited to Kant, Fichte, German idealism in general. He's the author, editor, or co-editor of 37 books and the author of over 400 articles. I'll name two relevant ones to today's talk. So there's from 2022, an article entitled Liberty and Freedom, Hegel on Civil Society and the Political State, and an article forthcoming entitled Et in America Ego. Subtitle is Fichte's Liberal and Egalitarian Critique of Colonization, Servitude, and Slavery, forthcoming in the volume entitled Fichte in the Americas, edited by Elizabeth Milan and Jimena Soleil is over there. I think you have a copy of it.
I have a copy of Spanish.
So the Spanish version of the book has been published already, and the English one will be, the translation is being published now, will be published soon. Okay, excellent. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and for hosting yet another fantastic conference, as it seems to be shaping up here at Leuven, and in a format that allows those of us who are still a bit apprehensive about using public conveyances to participate in full in a meeting like this. I begin my talk by referring you to the handout that should be in front of you or on your screen. And in turn, the handout begins with two motti for my talk that I want to briefly comment upon. The first one is on the left of the top of the page there, from Hölderlin's late elegy, Bread and Wine, a line that he inserted into the finished text several years afterwards, and that introduces our key term colony into a phrase and into a perspective that I will pursue from Hölderlin into Hegel's work. It's the line, spirit loves colonies and courageously forgetting. And the colonies here, in some readings, it's the singular colony, refers to the progressive investment of spirit in its course from east to west, from India over Greece to Hesperic Europe. That is as much a course of forgetting as it is one of new foundings, and that is also on Hölderlin's understanding a course of increase as much as of diminishing. The second quote is inauthentic. It is not to be found, as it writes in Horace, the epistles. It's rather a version of a verse in Horace. Horace talks about Greece caught, being captured by the Romans, and in turn capturing this ferocious victor. Horace means the Greek culture overlay that came to Rome after its conquest of Greece. And the adaptation that I'm proposing here is to have a similar reading of Germany, the broad sense of Germania, that there too, after an initial phase of Germany being caught, captured, colonized, there is a reversal of colonization that we can consider and that I will consider with Hegel's help in the paper today. And here, it's the theme of the, in Hegel's terms, dialectical course of conquest or of empire that we should be looking at. Conceptually, I will distinguish between colonialism and colonization. Colonialism as a historical phenomenon in Greco-Roman antiquity, in early modern times, more recently in the 19th and 20th century and through today, and colonialism as the discourse pro or contra, but also in various forms articulated as ideology, as Marx would say, as discourse in the formal sense, as Foucault would say, or in this case, in an Enlightenment discourse to which I think Hegel still belongs, about the perspective on colonization and colonialism. Generally speaking, my interest in colonialism and colonization is, spatially speaking, geopolitical, and temporally speaking, world historical. I'm less interested in issues of ethics here and morality around colonization than in some broader political perspective on the phenomenon. I'll be proceeding at two levels, a level of Hegel texts and a level of context to Hegel texts that are themselves texts, namely Hegel's own texts on it and slightly prior texts from the late 18th century that shape Hegel's thinking on these matters. Let's then turn to the next section on the handout, where I will now read the abstract to introduce the main perspective of the paper. I propose to place Hegel's brief but incisive contribution to the modern debate about the economics, the civics, and the politics of colonization to be found primarily in a particular section, very short, 248, of Elements of Philosophy of Right, into its broader historical and systematic context. So first I will trace the Western practice of colonization from Greco-Roman antiquity to European early modernity, but not as history to be retold, but as it is refracted and reflected in primary sources that were also in Hegel's mind in thinking about these things. And as a primary source then for the political philosophical assessment of these developments serves Monsieur with two works. First, an earlier work, 1734, Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and of their Decline. And second, his main work, Spirit of the Laws. Supplemented then by considerations of the political economy of colonization in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, somewhat later, closer to Hegel even. So then I will locate Hegel's pronouncements on colonization in the systematic context of his philosophy of right in general, and what he himself calls the dialectic of prosperity and pauperity in the modern citizen state, what he calls civil society, bürgerliche Gesellschaft in particular. And finally then, I will draw on Hegel's philosophy of history contained in the final part of his philosophy of right, and as an entire body, his Berlin lectures on world history, for a reading of the Germanic succession to the West Roman Empire, that is late antiquity, early medieval development, as involving a reverse colonization process with regard to Rome's own earlier colonizing conquest in northwestern Europe. So in Hegel's Montesquieu-inspired reading of the East-West colonizing course of the world's successive juridical political systems, empires, as he calls them, Reiche, Europe's post-antiquity civico-political order manifests from early medieval through early modern times, effectively Hegel's own times, and chiefly characterized by various forms and modes of civico-political representation, German term Repräsentation, emerges as an original Western European, Hegel says Germanic in this context, alternative form of government. The term in English and French is also Gothic government, less so in German. Alternative form of government to, on one side, the so-called despotic form of government in ancient Orient. Despotic here means lordly, masterly in some technical sense, and the aristodemocratic form of government in Greco-Roman antiquity. Let's now take a look at the terminology here. So we're dealing with Greek and Latin sources and also French, English, and German discussion of the matter. The Greek term is apoikia, that contains the word oikos for house, household in a broader sense. So it's interesting to note that the Greek term refers to new foundings at the, you might say, domestic level, primarily, although of course there is a political aspect to it. The Latin term is colonia. It's a special type of city that is founded in conquered territory. The French then is colony, colonie, and colony in English. And the German still has, at least in older German, the choice between the Latinized term Kolonie and the Germanic variant to that, Pflanzstadt, no longer used today. And another term that is very important in the context, also a Germanic term, is Landnahme, seizure of land, meaning a taking of land, inhabited or not, that is then populated by another population element that comes to that land, usually overseas. Again, a look at the text then. You have the French title there for the earlier Montesquieu text. That is a prelude to the later work and gives an interesting perspective on Rome in relation to the European development. Then the Spirit of the Laws itself, The Wealth of Nations by Smith. And in case of Hegel now, I will refer later on, not in the earlier part of the material, to Hegel's early, extensive but fragmentary work on the German Constitution, Kritik der Verfassung Deutschlands, as it's called in the critical edition. Earlier translations leave out the Kritik. It's not an authentic title, and it's also not about a particular constitution in Germany or of Germany. It's rather a reflection of Hegel's political historical analysis of the German Empire at the time, the old Germano-Roman Empire, and its legal setup between public law, private law, customary law, that he analyzes and in part critiques, but also assesses for its future potential. Then, of course, the philosophy of right, and then lectures on the philosophy of right, and lectures from the 1820s up through 1830, 31, the very end of Hegel's life, on the philosophy of world history. So we're proceeding in 3 steps, as far as the structure is concerned, that also provide the conceptual grid for our way of looking at these materials. We have colonialism and colonization with regard to Montesquieu and Smith, the concept, as well as the historical practices under that concept. We have the difference in Hegel between ancient and modern colonization, chiefly in elements of philosophy of right and in edited material to that published body of work by Hegel. And third, the distinction between Roman rule and Gothic government as types of political organization, chiefly on the basis of the lectures on world history, but also on that early piece on the German Constitution that I was referring to before. We'll postpone the thesis and the subsidiary thesis because they can serve as a summary conclusion at the end of the presentation, and we'll return to them at that point. Let's now start by taking a closer look at the 14 quotations altogether that you will find listed on the handout here. They're given in the original language, but I'll be translating the parts that we talk about, and we'll be commenting and analyzing them. So we begin with Montesquieu from his considerations on the Romans, grandeur and decline. And there he makes it clear that Rome finds itself in a perpetual state of war and a violent course of history throughout its development. And that's very important to recognize, because the typical picture is that Rome becomes imperial and then expands into other parts of Mediterranean world, and that the Republic is much more self-contained. And the picture that comes through in Montesquieu is much more of a continual characterization over this division between Republic and Empire that makes the entire development from the beginning one of conquest and expansion from an initial city into other parts of the coast of Latium surrounding Rome, into ever more extended parts of Italy to the north and the south, and of course also into the east. And then finally into other parts of Europe further north and into other parts of the Mediterranean, west and east as much as south. And this all already under the Republic. It's also under the Republic that Rome engages in the war against Carthage. And the perspective that is introduced then by Montesquieu is to say it's an imperialist and in that sense colonializing and conquest-oriented political entity from the beginning. There is no division between a more peaceful republic and a more expansive and dictatorial empire at the other end. It's an imperialist republic from its beginning as a way of existing and asserting its existence in this environment in which it seeks to flourish. And that also leads to the phenomenon of colonization. Colonization is then a way of establishing posts of control of conquered land that is settled with Roman population, either veteran soldiers or citizens that seek economic opportunities, that also retain their civic status in Rome as Roman citizens. And the special term colonia is then used only for a few hundred years for towns that have a particular importance as key founding points of extra Roman main strongholds of the empire, of the emerging, expanding empire. The most noticeable of these phenomena is the very town that still has the name colony in its name, the German city of Cologne. That was the main colony, also called Colonia, Colonia Claudia, Agrippinensium, in the Roman imperial expansion, starting in the 1st century before Christ, and then into several centuries afterwards. Generally, it's a policy of Romanization, not only of bringing into these colonial areas Roman population, veterans, and upwardly mobile Roman citizens, potentially even freed slaves that get settled there. It's also the phenomenon of Romanizing the local population, especially apparent in the Gallo-Roman population blend that is created in Belgium, part of Netherlands today, in France, as part of the centuries of Roman occupation since the conquest by Caesar. So this is a key quote for the intimate tie of colonizing, of colonies, to the phenomenon of conquest and of imperial activity. Second one, Rome then is, properly speaking, Montesquieu again in the considerations, not a monarchy and also not a republic in the sense of a contained and structurally homogeneous entity, but it is Rome, the head of a body, a political body that is composed of all the people of the world. A somewhat exaggerated phrase, of course, but it's the known world, as the Romans themselves would say, our world and our sea, the Mediterranean, around which pretty much throughout the Mediterranean world, Rome establishes its reign that is now neither a monarchy nor republic. It doesn't have the strength and the focus and the centralization of a monarchy. And it's also not as connected to the connotation of freedom, political freedom, as a republic would be. So Montesquieu needs other terms to describe the particular, some would say, monstrous body that is created here by this single head of everything, and the body that consists of its provincial and colonial expansion over several hundred years. Let's now change to the discussion of colonialism in Montesquieu in the spirit of the laws. It becomes broader. It's not only the original phenomenon in Rome, but it becomes the perspective on modern, early modern, and even contemporary colonization. And there, first point is to contrast the Spanish colonization in South America with other colonizations and forms of colonization in other parts of America, the Americas. So there, the Spanish regarded these newly discovered lands as objects of conquest. More refined peoples, so he leaves it open who that is, but he's referring to the North American, especially the British, to some extent, the French colonization of North America then, found that they were objects of commerce rather than conquest. And they turned their views to that aspect and that function of these entities. So there we have a very interesting difference here, also conceptually, between conquest and commerce, conquête and commerce, already dominant in Montesquieu's discussion of colonization, and then especially important in a Montesquieu-inspired work by a contemporary of Hegel's, the Franco-Swiss political philosopher, novelist also, Benjamin Constant, who writes ostensibly critiquing Napoleonic usurpation, but much more generally treating of the difference between ancient forms of conquest and modern forms of economic conquest and economic competition under the heading commerce. That's an important dualism that deeply informs Hegel's thinking on this matter as well. Next passage then, under number 4. So the colonies find themselves in a form of dependence, but very rarely so in the ancient case, where they're much more independent foundings with very loose connection to the original city from which they might have originated and undertaken the founding. And instead, it's the modern colonies that maintain this kind of dependence, either through the state itself or through some commercial society. That's the next key feature. The way that early modern political entities contract the colonial, commercial, but also conquest aspect of the activity to companies they found, they sometimes supervise, or they privatize, such as the British or the Dutch East India Company. They become international agents, global players, you might even say at the time, in comparison to such similar phenomena in recent times. And the point is to create favorable commerce conditions between the metropole, the capital city that does the trading, and the colony which with the trading goes. And through there being multiple colonies and colonization and commerce relations, it's also a phenomenon of importing and then exporting colonial goods, of using the metropolis as the point of turnover for the trade from east to west and from west to east. And all of this done for the expansion of commerce rather than for the older goal of founding another town or a new empire. summarized in the next quote then, how this is an international and indeed a global form of interaction, that it's not unilaterally between one country and another one. So the effect, especially of the discovery of America, Montesquieu says, is to connect Europe, not with America, but Europe, Asia, and Africa in a global network of trading of goods and people, as one would have to add, that go in multiple ways in all kinds of directions. Let's now turn to Smith's perspective on this. The Smith perspective is, of course, primarily an economical one, but it is tied into something we discussed already earlier, the stadial view of history and of cultural development that also serves as a justificatory basis for these colonial asymmetrical relations. So the colony is either a waste country or it's thinly inhabited. And the natives easily give place to the new settlers, who then, under these conditions, there advance more rapidly to wealth and greatness than any other human society, because they are in a comparatively unobstructed and competition-free space. Also, the colonists come with a body of knowledge that makes them superior in their endeavors to the savage and barbarous nations. Technical terms at the time, savage means hunters, gatherers, maybe herding tribes and nations. Barbarous means established and possibly even civilized nations, but differently civilized than the European colonists. And the colonists also come already with habits of subordination, hierarchical social and political structures, and are effective then at importing governmental structures and legal systems into the country. This brings us finally to the Hegel part, where we're looking now at the philosophy of right and at the tie-in with migration of peoples on a large scale. So Hegel has a very extensive and broad perspective here that includes the development hinted at by the Hölderlin line at the beginning, from India through Middle Asia, Near Asia, into Europe, where at the time already there was beginning knowledge of these gigantic migratory processes, based especially on language discoveries like Schlegel's work on Sanskrit and the developing sense of an Indo-European language family that would allow to track at the linguistic level demographic developments thousands of years back. Key elements in the Hegel quote here are then that one needs to move on and find territory for colonization because of congestion in a given country. And he's not only talking about Europe here and Europe's further expansion to the New World, but for the earlier processes even into Europe. And that a key feature of this colonization event, departure, is typically that it involves an ocean or a sea that has to be crossed. And that might be, in the first instance, then the Mediterranean, but then also in further expansion, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, eventually even the Pacific. So they can call here the sea the element of industry, industry in the general sense of productive labor, and relating that to the commercial and generally economic activity of civil society. Then the reference in the famous section 246 to the dialectic of civil society that isn't rich enough to take care of its entire population, that has always a stratum of impoverished part of the population, and that resorts to colonization for, in part, a population surplus that can be exported to the colonies, and in part for introducing goods and for creating labor around that colonial traffic. Further distinction of importance is in Hegel then, again in the philosophy of right, between sporadic and systematic colonization, where the sporadic one is the departing of individual families. The systematic one is the standard colonizing attempt. That Hegel now says in the next quote, number 10, quite extended, there is no systematic colonization at the time, of course, not yet having in view Germany's late 19th century attempt to find, as it was called, its place in the sun by acquiring colonies in Africa, China, and so on. So he talks about systematic colonization for other countries and contrasts the way that it happens in Greece, not so much in Rome that he's interested in here, systematic, that the population finds other places for taking care of its overflow and congestion to preserve the freedom of the citizens. So it's an act of maintaining civic and political freedom that leads to this colonization. And if you look at a map, you can see that the entire Mediterranean, starting from archaic times and into classical times till the 4th century, becomes colonized by Greece from today's Spanish coast through the North African coast to southern Italy and Sicily to the Black Sea and the entire eastern end of the Mediterranean, in a situation that leads Plato in the Phaedo to describe it as though it were frogs placed on the edge of a pond all around. And Hegel now very perceptively contrasts this freedom-oriented enterprise with the different kind of colonization in modern times that grants significantly less rights to the citizens in the colonies than to those in the motherlands. That brings him to the discussion of the American situation, especially North America, lacking representation in parliament, and to a final consideration that in the end, England has profited from America's freedom by profiting of the commerce with an independent and flourishing country. And you have an abbreviated version of these points under 10 from the philosophy of right that has this artificially generated un-Hegelian edition, Zusatz to paragraph 248, taken from the lectures that I just gave you under number 10 before. And let's now in conclusion turn to the material from the early writing on the German Constitution and the associated points from the late lectures on the philosophy of world history. Hegel recognizes that the system of representation, political representation, is a novelty in Northern European development, that neither Greek direct democracy, as we would call it, nor the elements of direct democracy in the Roman Republican system have any precedent for parliamentary representation of this formal kind that we recognize since the Middle Ages in England and in other forms in various consultative or even legislative bodies in other European countries. And in a world historical perspective, then, he sees the development from Oriental despotism through in imperial republic, meaning Rome, and through the development of a third universal shape of world spirit, as he calls it. This is 1800 essentially, 20 years before these things or even more get worked out in the philosophy of history in his Berlin years. And in that context also, he would use the term Gothic government to convey that it's the Germanic kingdoms that are created in the wake of the migrations of late antiquity, in which these representations are first realized. Visigothic and Ostrogothic developments in South and Southwestern Europe, Spain, Portugal, France, and of course, similar developments then in the Frankish Empire founding before it splits into France and Germany in the Middle Ages in Northwestern Europe. And Hegel's conclusion that without such a representative body, freedom is no longer thinkable. It has been the advance of this, Haldane would say, colonizing course of spirit from east to west to have introduced this form of political organization. I come to the close by leaving out the quotes 13 and 14 that give an almost spiritual interpretation of this advance in freedom and in political structure. The quote under 15 from the later lectures on world history summarizes the earlier point from the Constitution of Germany in this procedure from despotism through democracy and aristocracy to monarchy. And what he means by monarchy is, in essence, constitutional monarchy. Maybe not with a formal constitution, but with bodies in addition to the monarch that contain representation. Representation initially, primarily of the nobility, and subsequently also in the second chamber, typically of the commons, as exemplified in the British system. Let's then turn in conclusion to the main thesis that can now serve as a summary. In addition to Hegel countenancing colonization as a suitable means for addressing specific socio-economic problems of late archaic and early classical Greek polis on one side and modern civil society on the other side, the comprehensive conquest of the defunct Roman Empire and its civilization by these Germanic migration phenomena, together with the introduction of entirely new principles of rule and completely novel forms of government in the aftermath of these developments in late antiquity, as also analyzed by Hegel in the Constitution of Germany and later writings, can be seen to constitute a geopolitical act of reversed colonization, manifesting the course of empire, leading geographically from east to west and northwest, and politically from Oriental despotism through Greek democracy and Roman republicanism, by way of the latest generation, to Germanic, Gothic, as it has been called, representative rule under the principle of everyone's equal freedom. And to bring this to a more contemporary discussion then, as the subsidiary thesis, given the universal world historical as well as geopolitical scope of colonization in Hegel, the current discourse of colonialism and post-colonialism may need to be extended to include the correlated figures of the colonizing colonized and the colonized colonizer among the agents and recipients of colonialisms and post-colonialism's comprehensive scenario, past, present, and future, and into this dialectic of conquest, the dialectic of colonization. I would include such phenomena as the presence of the Indian community in England, down to currently the PM being Indian by nationality and ethnicity, the Algerian or generally North African presence in France, to some extent also African presence in Italy, the quasi-neocolonial presence of China in Europe in developments such as the Silk Road Initiative or investments in Italian textile firms, the investment and presence of China in Africa, and of course, the presence, political and economic, of the United States in Europe. All phenomena of this colonial dialectic or conquest dialectic that I wanted to introduce here by reference to Hegel and Hegel's own sources on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much for that talk. So we are a bit over time. I sense there will be a lot of questions, so if I can just ask you to keep them brief, if at all possible. The floor is now open for questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I do have just a brief question. I wanted to know if you could say a little bit more about the relation of freedom of commerce to the sort of the more violent colonialism which you were talking about both in Rome and in the Spanish influence.
I didn't hear the first word.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to know a little bit more about the relation between the commercial colonization.
Oh, yeah,
and,
commercial.
Yeah.
Yeah. You rightly hint at the violent nature of this commercial development. It's not a contrast between a belligerent and martial conquest on one side and a peaceful and congenial commerce on the other side. So I would say these are two forms of highly competitive and even in some sense highly destructive activities. It would be more important, in my perspective on the material, to describe them as different in modality than as making one good and one evil, or one acceptable and one objectionable. That was not my intention. But thank you very much for getting that point clear.
The next question comes from online from Efraim Lazo.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Gunther, for a very interesting talk. I just wanted to see if I found the distinction between colonization and colonialism very useful. The distinction between the discourse and the practice, right, or the processes. So in this context, I would like to ask you if your work here, your proposal, makes space for a phenomenon that can be called self-colonization. This has been prompted by work on the concept of imperium by José Luis Villacañas in Spain, and from other places, this idea of self-colonization. So the idea is, for instance, that Spain, contemporary Spain, the contemporary Spanish state, can be, understood as undergoing a process of self-colonization, right? And so this could be extended also to the British Imperium, and of course to the non-recognized U.S. Imperium. So I wonder if your distinction would allow for this idea of self-colonization, and what do you think about it? Thank you very much.
That's a very interesting perspective. The self in the phrase self-colonization indicates to me a sense of agency and responsibility that may be part of this notion, but it may not be intended. So that alternative terms such as unintentional recolonization and things like that might capture the phenomenon without the connotation of spontaneity and agency that are here in the term. Is that agency intended, or is it indeed more a phenomenon that describes colonization features that unintentionally might be creeping up?
I think it's intentional.
Uh-huh.
So it is agency. But you know,
Is it?
yeah, you're
What's-
right. I mean,
Is the point then that former colonies are imitated, or that traits of former colonies are introduced into the former motherland, or what's the import of the term for the country in question?
well,
Spain.
the idea is that having exhausted the forces that led to the processes of colonialism, then those forces are turned against whatever representation of Spain is at stake. So I don't want to essentialize any of this, but this is the idea that having exhausted places to colonize and peoples, so then you know the very subjects, the very Spanish subjects or subjects of the monarchy are being colonized in a way.
Yeah, good.
So this is the idea.
That seems to me a descendant of the Marxian view that the revolutionary bourgeoisie produces its own gravediggers and undermines its own development. Interesting perspective. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a question from Franz.
Yes, thank you, good for a very informative talk. A lot of interesting things regarding the context of Hegel's discussions. I have a question regarding your subsidiary thesis at the end. So I was wondering whether it's not important in pursuing this line of thought to distinguish much more clearly than Hegel does between something like peaceful migration and colonial processes in a more violent sense. I mean, among the examples that you gave, it would seem that there are huge differences between something like African migration to Europe and the presence of an African diaspora in Europe on the one hand, and US and Chinese hegemonic politics. So I've been surprised by those phenomena in the same list. And I was wondering whether that has to do with something like an ambiguity in Hegel's usage of these terms, or anyway.
I intentionally grouped all these phenomena together because I wanted to see global patterns rather than to differentiate between individual such phenomena. And the global pattern would be continued migratory processes that are in part demographic, in part they are more commercial in investment and in political influence. And all of these things belong into a broader conception of colonization that I would follow now in its, as I called it with Hegel, dialectical development, in that the former agents of these processes become now acted upon by similar developments that have drawn in entirely different actors. But you're right to point out that there's quite a difference between migrants coming to the shores of Europe on one side and these more structural developments on the other side. With talking about the population presence, I was more even talking about populations that have been in Europe present already for decades, like the Algerians in Paris, the suburbs, or the Indian presence in Britain, and especially in London, that has also been a development for decades. So these are not the recent arrivals in migration developments, but they are already reflecting the post-colonial composition of the societies of the former colonizers that themselves have undergone this radical change. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 online questions. So next up, Rocio from Anna.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Stoller, for such a wonderful talk. I actually wanted to follow up on the question that was asked before about the distinction between conquest and commerce. I'm interested to know, I want to go back to Montesquieu and to Constant and to really track this because it's central to work that I'm doing now. Can you say more about whether you see a construction of conceptions or attributions of humanity and agency that are distinguishable along those two axes? So these, there's a set of debates in Caribbean political economy and Black critical thought, the work of Sylvia Wynter, the work of many others who are thinking through the construction of the concept of, or the concept of the human and attributions of agency that were actually critical for and compatible with the transatlantic slave trade, and were not, precisely because of the question of commerce, were not of the same kind of discussions that were happening in the justifications of the conquest that had to do with the humanity or the non-humanity of indigenous peoples. So I wonder whether you could, reflect a little bit about how you see that at work in the text that you're examining. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think it's quite interesting that this is a perspective that doesn't enter into Montesquieu's discussion of the matter. He does not say that there is a greater regard for the humanity of either the enslaved or the conquered population under conditions of commerce than under conquest. He says that it's a more refined view, meaning that it leads to better economic yield, that the Spanish ruined themselves over the exploitation of the New World, and the English became prosperous, even if vicariously so, by creating a prosperous colony. And that's also what I hinted at the very beginning when I said it's a political interest that I have here, political, philosophical, not an ethical, moral interest. And it's of course disturbing to find texts that don't address this other dimension, but it's also evidence of how shielded from ethical implications the discussion is as late as early 19th century. And the discussion, if it takes place at all, is a juridical discussion about legal rights of the citizens or of the inhabitants of colonized worlds. It's not even primarily a moral discussion, or it may be a theological discussion in that the humanity is cast in terms of their status as to be Christianized or already Christian. Thank you.
Can I say something very quickly? Yes, so thank you so much. That's very helpful. So the question also was a bit not to move it to the question to the moral status. I'm sorry for the noise, and I can't really do anything about it. So not really a question of the moral status, but the creation or the genesis of a type of epistemic imagination that constructs ideas of humanity through these processes and along these two axes. So rather than thinking about the question morally, but thinking about the production of and then the deployment of ideas of the human, at work in these juridical and economic discussions. Thank you again.
But the other question would be, what comes first? Is there first a new type of discourse that comes, and then the recognition, oh, they are to be included in the discourse? Or is it the recognition that operative categories need to be so modified that others are included in it, and then the discourse changes? Thank you.
Okay, and our final question from Fernando is.
Okay, thank you very much. Very quick. So I'm curious a little bit. You mentioned that just now, but I'm curious about. I mean, your reading of Hegel was very political or geopolitical, which was very interesting. But then, I was curious about what is your take about this debate of how productive is to separate politics from, I don't know, metaphysics or logic. For example, in the case of Hegel, I understand you're interested in non including here an ethical debate, and I think that's completely valid. But nevertheless, I wanted to know like your general take about what to do with these authors when they mix politics and logic and metaphysics. Yeah, thank you.
It brings us back to our discussion about the positivism of the late Schelling. And I think that there is really something to be gained from introducing a logical framework that is not abstractly applied, but that is to be concretely rendered by these developments. It structures, as I would see it already, Hegel's perception of these situations. And of course, it is a vehicle for communicating them and for lending them a form that is argumentative rather than the cultivation or the articulation of prejudice. So I think it's very essential. And my point was not to exclude that dimension, but to exclude this moral and ethical level that prevails often in the discussion of the issue when we look at these historical authors. But the logical side, I would see it, but again, I would not see it so that you have a predetermined and fixed framework that you import. It needs to be a way of bringing both of these things together in what Rawls would call a reflective equilibrium. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that talk and that discussion.
Thank you.